at 0600 hours on February 16, 1945. Commander Robert Dixon, 36 years old, Task Force 58 operations officer, stood in the flag plot aboard USS Lexington looking at the tactical display that showed 15 American fleet carriers spread across 40 square miles of Pacific Ocean 200 miles southeast of Tokyo, and Dixon, who'd been planning carrier operations since Midway, who'd coordinated strikes at Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, who understood carrier warfare as well as any officer in the Pacific Fleet, felt something close to awe at the force he was coordinating: 11 Essex-class fleet carriers, 4 Independence-class light carriers, 1,200 combat aircraft, 90,000 sailors and airmen, representing more carrier striking power concentrated in one place than had existed in the entire world in 1941. And Dixon, who would coordinate this morning's strike against Tokyo, the first carrier attack on the Japanese capital since Doolittle's raid in 1942, understood that he was orchestrating not just a military operation, but a demonstration of American industrial and tactical supremacy so overwhelming that Japanese resistance had become mathematically futile. Dixon had the strike plan memorized, but reviewed it anyway because coordinating 15 carriers launching simultaneous strikes required precision that left no room for error. Task Group 58.1 with carriers Hornet, Wasp, Bennington, and below would strike airfields north of Tokyo. Task Group 58.2 with carriers Lexington, Hancock, San Jacinto, and Bataan would strike aircraft factories in Tokyo suburbs. Task Group 58.3 with carriers Essex, Bunker Hill, Cowpens, and Cabot would strike shipping in Tokyo Bay. Task Group 58.4 with carriers Yorktown, Randolph, and Langley would provide combat air patrol over the task force, and the coordination required that 560 aircraft launch within 30-minute window, form up by task group, fly coordinated approach routes that prevented mid-air collisions, strike targets simultaneously to overwhelm Japanese defenses, and return to their assigned carriers without confusion. And Dixon, who'd coordinated strikes involving 3 or 4 carriers, understood that coordinating 15 carriers represented exponential increase in complexity rather than linear scaling. But what made this morning's strike unprecedented wasn't just the number of carriers or aircraft, but the operational philosophy it represented. Task Force 58 wasn't raiding Tokyo like Doolittle had done, wasn't conducting hit-and-run attack like Halsey had done earlier in the war, but was announcing permanent presence, was demonstrating that American carrier forces could operate within 200 miles of Japanese home islands with impunity, could strike the enemy capital repeatedly, could maintain pressure that Japanese forces couldn't counter because Japan no longer had carriers or naval aviation capable of threatening Task Force 58, and the psychological impact of American carriers operating freely in Japanese home waters was as important as the physical damage the strikes would inflict. Dixon thought about December 7, 1941. When 6 Japanese carriers had struck Pearl Harbor with 400 aircraft, when that force had represented the most powerful carrier striking force ever assembled, when America had been desperate and outmatched and struggling to survive, and now 40 months later America was striking Tokyo with 15 carriers and 1,200 aircraft, was operating with numerical superiority so overwhelming that the comparison to Pearl Harbor was almost insulting, was demonstrating that industrial capacity and organizational skill could create military dominance that tactical brilliance couldn't overcome, and Dixon, who'd lived through America's darkest days in 1942, felt vindicated watching American power project itself into enemy homeland. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet, of which Task Force 58 was the carrier component, had briefed Dixon yesterday on the strategic purpose of these strikes. "Commander, we're not just hitting military targets, we're breaking Japanese will to resist, we're showing the Japanese people that their military cannot protect them, we're demonstrating that American power is irresistible, and were preparing conditions for invasion by destroying Japanese air forces before they can interfere. With Okinawa landings, your coordination of Task Force 58 directly supports strategic objectives that go far beyond tactical damage. Dixon checked the chronometer, 0615 hours, 15 minutes until launch, and Dixon began the radio coordination that would send 560 aircraft into the sky. All task groups, this is Lexington actual, prepare to commence launch operations on schedule. Weather is clear, winds are favorable, enemy air activity is minimal, execute strike plan as briefed, radio discipline after launch. Good hunting, and across 40 square miles of ocean 15 carriers began final preparations for the largest coordinated carrier strike in naval history, and Dixon, who would monitor every phase of the operation from flag plot, understood that this morning Task Force 58 would demonstrate what American carrier warfare had become, not desperate struggle for survival, but methodical application of overwhelming force. Task Force 58 is constituted in February 1945. Represented the culmination of 3 years of American carrier warfare development, 15 carriers organized into 4 task groups, each task group operating semi-independently, but coordinated through common doctrine and radio communication, and the organizational structure reflected lessons learned from Coral Sea and Midway and Philippine Sea, reflected understanding that multiple carriers operating together multiplied combat power through mutual support and concentration of force, and Task Force 58's structure allowed flexibility. Task groups could disperse to avoid submarine or air attack, could concentrate for major strikes, could rotate through refueling and rearming without reducing overall force readiness, and this operational flexibility gave Task Force 58 capabilities that no previous naval force had possessed. The specific carriers comprising Task Force 58 in February 1945 showed American industrial dominance: Essex-class fleet carriers Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, Wasp, Hancock, Bennington, Bunker Hill, Essex, Randolph, Ticonderoga, and Shangri-La, each displacing 27,000 tons, each carrying 90 aircraft, each built in 18 months at cost of $70 million, representing peak of American naval engineering and industrial capacity, and Independence-class light carriers below Wood, San Jacinto, Bataan, Cabot, Cowpens, and Langley, each displacing 11,000 tons, each carrying 35 aircraft, each converted from cruiser hulls in 14 months, representing American ability to improvise and adapt, and together these 15 carriers embarked 1,200 aircraft and represented more carrier aviation power than existed in all other navies combined. Dixon had compiled statistics comparing Task Force 58 to historical carrier forces, and the numbers were staggering. Task Force 58's 1,200 aircraft compared to 400 aircraft in the Japanese force that struck Pearl Harbor. Task Force 58's 15 carriers compared to 6 Japanese carriers at Pearl Harbor. Task Force 58's air group pilots averaged 300 hours training compared to Japanese pilots at Pearl Harbor who averaged 800 hours. But current Japanese pilots who averaged 60 hours, and every metric showed American superiority was absolute, was growing rather than shrinking, was backed by production capacity that launched new Essex-class carrier every 6 weeks while Japan had commissioned its last carrier in 1944 and would build no more. But the carriers themselves were only part of Task Force 58's power. The force included 8 fast battleships providing anti-aircraft defense and shore bombardment capability, 14 cruisers for anti-aircraft and anti-surface warfare, 83 destroyers screening against submarines and providing anti-aircraft fire and rescue services for downed pilots, and this supporting force represented another manifestation of American naval dominance because Task Force 58 operated with destroyer screen that was larger than most nations' entire navies, operated with battleship support that European navies would envy, operated with logistics train that could refuel and rearm the entire force at sea without returning to port. The logistics were unprecedented. Task Force 58 consumed 400,000 gallons of aviation fuel daily, 12,000 gallons of fuel for each aircraft sortie, required continuous replenishment from fleet oilers that accompanied the force, and Task Force 58 could operate for 30 days without touching port, could steam 5,000 miles, could launch 3,000 sorties, could maintain combat operations through at-sea replenishment that allowed sustained pressure Japanese forces couldn't match because Japanese logistics required returning to port for resupply, required fixed bases that American submarines and aircraft had destroyed, required supply lines that American forces had severed. Admiral Mark Mitcher commanding Task Force 58 understood that the force's size created both opportunities and challenges, opportunities because 15 carriers could overwhelm any defense, could strike multiple targets simultaneously, could maintain combat air patrol that made Japanese air attack suicidal. But challenges because coordinating 15 carriers required communication and doctrine and training that smaller forces didn't need, required staff work that prevented confusion, required organizational structure that maintained unity of effort across geographically dispersed units, and Mitcher, who'd commanded carrier forces since 1942. Had developed the doctrine and procedures that allowed Task Force 58 to function as integrated weapon rather than collection of individual carriers. Dixon reviewed Task Force 58's organization one more time before strikes launched. Each task group had one carrier designated as guide, maintaining course and speed while other carriers maneuvered relative to guide, and this formation allowed simultaneous launch operations where all carriers turned into wind together, launched aircraft in coordinated sequence, and recovered aircraft without collision or confusion, and the formation also provided mutual anti-aircraft defense where every ship's guns could engage attacking aircraft, where overlapping fire zones created defensive barrier that Japanese pilots described as flying into steel curtain, and the formation's defensive strength meant Task Force 58 could operate within range of land-based Japanese aircraft with confidence that defensive firepower would destroy attackers before they reached carriers. At 0630 hours Task Force 58 turned into the wind, 15 carriers simultaneously, and flight deck crews began launching the first wave, Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters first providing combat air patrol and fighter escort, then Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, then Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers configured as level bombers, and the launch sequence required 30 minutes during which 560 aircraft roared off 15 flight decks, formed up by squadron, assembled into strike groups, and departed on assigned vectors toward Tokyo, and Dixon monitoring launch operations from Lexington flag plot watched the tactical display as friendly aircraft symbols multiplied, as strike groups formed coherent units, as the air armada that would hit Tokyo 2 hours from now took shape according to plan. Lieutenant Commander John Bridgers, commanding VF-9 Fighter Squadron from Yorktown, led his 16 Hellcats off the flight deck at 0637 hours, climbed to 15,000 feet, waited as other squadrons formed on him, and Bridgers, who'd flown combat missions since Guadalcanal, had never been part of strike force this large, had never seen sky so full of friendly aircraft, had never participated in operation where American numerical superiority was so overwhelming that enemy opposition seemed impossible, and Bridgers counted aircraft around him. Fighters and dive bombers and torpedo planes from multiple carriers forming stream 20 miles long. And Bridgers understood that Tokyo was about to experience what Pearl Harbor had been, overwhelming carrier strike by force that couldn't be stopped. The strike groups flew toward Tokyo at 200 knots, maintained radio silence except for essential navigation calls, climbed to bombing altitude as they approached coast, and Bridgers, watching Japanese coastline appear through morning haze, felt the historical significance of the moment, American carriers striking the Japanese capital, demonstrating that 3 years of war had completely reversed the power balance, proving that Japan's defensive perimeter had collapsed and now Japan itself was the battlefield, and the psychological impact of carrier aircraft over Tokyo would resonate throughout Japan. Japanese defenses were minimal. Interceptor aircraft that appeared were overwhelmed by American fighter escorts, anti-aircraft fire from Tokyo was scattered and ineffective against aircraft attacking from 15,000 feet, and Japanese defenders who'd been told that American carriers would never reach Tokyo were now watching 1,200 American aircraft conduct systematic destruction of military targets, and the contrast between Japanese expectations and American reality was demoralizing, was proof that Japanese military claims about defensive strength were propaganda rather than fact. Bridger squadrons swept ahead of the bomber stream, encountered Japanese interceptors climbing from Yokota Airfield, engaged in brief dogfight that resulted in 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed for 0 American losses, and the kill ratio reflected training and equipment superiority that Japanese forces couldn't overcome. American pilots with 300 hours training versus Japanese pilots with 60 hours, Hellcats with 650 caliber machine guns versus Japanese fighters with 2 20mm cannons, American aircraft with armor and self-sealing fuel tanks versus Japanese aircraft that caught fire when hit, and every technical and training advantage favored Americans so completely that air combat was massacre rather than contest. The bomber waves struck Tokyo systematically, Task Group 58. One's aircraft hit Nakajima Aircraft Factory at Musashina, dropped 200 tons of bombs that destroyed assembly buildings and killed workers, Task Group 58. Two's aircraft struck Tachikawa Airfield, destroyed 75 aircraft on ground and cratered runways, Task Group 58. Three's aircraft attacked shipping in Tokyo Bay, sank 3 cargo ships and damaged port facilities, and the combined strikes achieved objectives with minimal losses. 11 American aircraft shot down, 549 returned safely. And the loss rate of 2% was acceptable, was sustainable, was proof that Task Force 58 could strike Tokyo repeatedly without unsustainable attrition. Dixon monitored strike results as reports came in: Musashina factory heavily damaged, fires visible from 50 miles, and Tachikawa airfield suppressed, multiple aircraft destroyed, and Tokyo Bay shipping attacked successfully, 3 vessels confirmed sunk, and each report confirmed that the strike had achieved its objectives, that coordinating 15 carriers had worked exactly as planned, that Task Force 58 could deliver overwhelming force with precision that maximized damage while minimizing losses, and Dixon, who'd spent weeks planning this operation, felt professional satisfaction that complex coordination had executed flawlessly. What made Task Force 58's operations unprecedented wasn't just the number of carriers, but the coordination required to prevent chaos. 15 carriers launching and recovering aircraft simultaneously required precise timing to prevent mid-air collisions, required radio discipline to prevent communication interference, required navigation precision to ensure aircraft returned to correct carriers, required fuel management to ensure aircraft didn't run out of fuel while searching for their carriers, and Dixon, who coordinated these operations, had developed procedures and doctrine that transformed potential chaos into organized efficiency. The specific coordination challenges were immense. Each carrier-operated aircraft with different fuel states and combat damage, required different recovery times, maintained different defensive positions, and operated with different crew experience levels. And coordinating recovery operations where 560 aircraft returned within 1 hour window required Dixon to sequence carrier recoveries so that each carrier recovered its own aircraft first, then took aboard aircraft from other carriers if those aircraft were fuel critical, and this flexible recovery system prevented losses from aircraft running out of fuel while waiting to land. Radio communication was critical, but also problematic. Task Force 58 operated on multiple frequencies: command net for task force coordination, tactical nets for each task group, fighter direction net for combat air patrol control, strike coordination net for attack groups, and maintaining radio discipline where 15 carriers and 1,200 aircraft shared limited frequencies required strict procedures about who could transmit when, required brief standardized message formats, required radio operators trained to decode messages instantly, and any breakdown in radio discipline would create interference that prevented essential communication. Lieutenant Howard Jenkins, fighter direction officer aboard Enterprise, controlled the combat air patrol that protected Task Force 58 from Japanese air attack, monitored radar contacts that appeared on his screen, vectored fighters to intercept threats before they reached the task force, and Jenkins, who'd been controlling fighters since 1943, had never managed combat air patrol with 72 fighters airborne simultaneously, 6 fighters per carrier rotating through 4-hour cycles, and the coordination required Jenkins to track each fighter's fuel state, position, altitude, and target assignment, required Jenkins to vector fighters efficiently to maximize coverage while minimizing fuel consumption, required split-second decisions about which threats were priority. The tactical situation Jenkins managed was unprecedented. Task Force 58 operated within 200 miles of Tokyo, within range of hundreds of Japanese land-based aircraft, and Japanese forces made multiple attempts to attack the carriers using both conventional bombers and kamikaze aircraft, and Jenkins' combat air patrol intercepted these attacks before they reached the fleet. February 16. 16 Japanese aircraft destroyed by fighters. 0 reached the task force. February 17, 30. 1 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 2 reached outer destroyer screen and were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. February 18, 43 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 1 kamikaze hit carrier Saratoga operating separately, causing significant damage. But Saratoga survived. But Jenkins' most important contribution was preventing friendly fire incidents, with 1,200 American aircraft operating simultaneously, with combat air patrol fighters engaging unidentified contacts, with nervous anti-aircraft gunners shooting at anything approaching the task force. The danger of fratricide was constant, and Jenkins maintained identification procedures that allowed returning strike aircraft to approach safely, maintained fighter discipline that prevented combat air patrol from attacking friendly aircraft, maintained communication with anti-aircraft directors that prevented ships from firing on American planes, and Jenkins' coordination prevented the friendly fire casualties that could have exceeded combat losses. Dixon coordinated the larger picture, tracked each carrier's aircraft status, how many launched, how many recovered, how many still airborne, tracked munitions expenditure and determined when carriers needed rearming, tracked fuel consumption and scheduled replenishment operations, coordinated task group movements to maintain formation while allowing individual carriers flexibility, and Dixon's coordination transformed 15 independent carriers into integrated striking force that operated with efficiency that smaller forces couldn't match. Task Force 58's ability to strike Tokyo repeatedly without returning to port depended on logistics capabilities that were unprecedented in naval warfare. Underway replenishment, where oilers and ammunition ships transferred fuel and munitions while steaming alongside carriers at 15 knots, and this at-sea logistics system allowed Task Force 58 to operate for 60 days without touching port, allowed continuous pressure that Japanese forces couldn't escape, allowed operational tempo that exhausted Japanese defenders who couldn't rest because Task Force 58 never withdrew, and the logistics achievement was as impressive as the combat achievement because sustained operations required industrial organization that only America possessed. Commander Thomas Fisher, logistics officer on Admiral Mitcher's staff, coordinated replenishment operations that kept 15 carriers fighting, scheduled each carrier's replenishment based on fuel state and munitions expenditure, assigned oilers and ammunition ships to specific carriers, coordinated timing so that carriers could conduct replenishment in sequence without disrupting task force operations, and Fisher, who'd been doing this job since 1943, understood that logistics was ultimately what separated Task Force 58 from Japanese carrier forces, because Japanese carriers that survived combat couldn't operate continuously due to fuel shortages, couldn't maintain pressure due to logistics limitations, couldn't compete with American force that never stopped. The specific numbers illustrated the logistics challenge. Each carrier consumed 40,000 gallons of aviation fuel daily, 15 carriers consumed 600,000 gallons daily. Task Force 58's fleet oilers carried 4 million gallons total, meaning complete task force fuel capacity lasted 7 days, requiring oilers to return to Ulithi anchorage for refueling while other oilers maintained the task force, and this rotating replenishment system kept Task Force 58 operational continuously by ensuring fresh oilers arrived before existing oilers ran dry. But fuel was only part of the logistics equation. Carriers also required munitions resupplied, bombs and torpedoes and machine gun ammunition, and aircraft spare parts and replacement aircraft to compensate for combat losses, and all these supplies had to be transferred at sea in heavy weather while both ships maneuvered to avoid submarine attack, and the technical challenge of transferring 20-ton bombs between ships in rough seas while maintaining 15-knot speed was substantial, required specialized equipment and trained crews and careful coordination that prevented accidents. Captain Ernest Ellsworth, commanding fleet oiler USS Neosho, had perfected the dangerous art of underway replenishment, had conducted 347 replenishment operations since 1943, had transferred 30 million gallons of fuel to carriers and battleships and cruisers, and Ellsworth, who understood that logistics determined combat capability, took professional pride in never losing a day of carrier operations due to fuel shortage, and Ellsworth's reliability meant Task Force 58 operated continuously while Japanese forces operated intermittently because Japanese logistics couldn't sustain continuous operations. The replenishment operation itself was dangerous. Neosho would approach carrier on parallel course at 15 knots, maintaining separation of 150 feet, close enough for fuel hoses to reach, but far enough to prevent collision, and gun crews would shoot weighted messenger lines to the carrier. Carrier crew would pull across heavier handling lines, would use handling lines to pull fuel hoses weighing hundreds of pounds, would secure fuel hoses to carriers' refueling stations, and then pumping would begin transferring fuel at rate of 2,000 gallons per minute while both ships maintained precise station keeping because any course change or speed variation could break fuel lines, causing fire hazard. Fisher watched replenishment operations with professional anxiety because one collision or fire could disable carrier that represented $1 billion of investment and thousands of lives, and Fisher had developed detailed procedures that minimized risk. Experienced captains conducted replenishment in daylight during good weather whenever possible, maintained continuous radio communication, positioned rescue destroyers nearby in case crew fell overboard, and these safety procedures reduced accidents, though they couldn't eliminate risk entirely, and occasional fuel spills or line breaks reminded everyone that at-sea replenishment was inherently dangerous. But the capability was essential. Task Force 58's operational flexibility depended on not requiring port visits, depended on ability to strike targets, then refuel at sea, then strike again without withdrawing, and this sustained pressure prevented Japanese forces from recovering between attacks, prevented repair of damaged facilities, prevented reinforcement of threatened positions, and the cumulative effect was that Task Force 58's continuous presence near Japan created psychological pressure, more effective than any single strike. February 21, 1945. 5 days into operations near Japan, and Task Force 58 faced the most dangerous threat to American carrier operations: kamikaze aircraft, suicide attackers who willingly died to sink carriers, who couldn't be deterred by defensive fire because destruction of their aircraft was their objective, who transformed air defense from calculating probability of shooting down attacker before he released weapons to absolute necessity of shooting down attacker before he hit ship, and Dixon, who'd planned operations assuming conventional air attack doctrine, suddenly had to adjust tactics for threat where enemy pilot success required his death, and the mathematical and psychological impact of kamikaze operations challenged everything American naval forces had learned about carrier defense. The kamikaze threat first appeared in October 1944. During Philippines campaign, when Japanese forces acknowledged they lacked pilots trained for conventional attack and decided that suicide attacks required less training while potentially achieving greater results, and the logic was grimly sound. Training pilot to fly bomb-laden aircraft into ship required maybe 60 hours compared to 300 hours for conventional attack training. Suicide attack guaranteed hit if pilot reached target compared to conventional attack where bombs often missed, and psychological impact of deliberate suicide shocked American defenders whose cultural assumptions made kamikaze tactics incomprehensible. Lieutenant Howard Jenkins, fighter direction officer, modified combat air patrol doctrine to counter kamikaze threat, increased number of fighters on patrol from 6 per carrier to 8, positioned fighters closer to task force at 50 miles rather than 100 miles to reduce interception time, emphasized absolute destruction of any approaching aircraft rather than just driving them away, and Jenkins' modified tactics reflected that kamikaze aircraft that weren't destroyed would hit something. That deterrence wasn't enough when pilot's death was the plan, that air defense had to achieve perfect success rate because even one kamikaze penetration could sink carrier. The combat on February 21 demonstrated both kamikaze threat and American defensive capability. Japanese forces launched 56 kamikaze aircraft against Task Force 58. Fighters intercepted and destroyed 38 before they reached Task Force. Anti-aircraft fire destroyed 17 more in outer defensive zone. One kamikaze penetrated defenses and hit fleet carrier Saratoga operating in Task Group 58.5. Crashed into flight deck, killing 123 sailors and destroying 42 aircraft, causing fires that burned for hours and nearly sank the ship. And Saratoga's damage from single kamikaze hit demonstrated that suicide attacks achieved more damage per attacking aircraft than conventional attack because kamikaze carried aircraft's full fuel load as incendiary in addition to bomb, because impact velocity was higher than conventional crash, because pilots steered for vulnerable parts of ship rather than hoping bomb hit. But what Task Force 58's combat on February 21 also demonstrated was that American defensive capabilities could defeat kamikaze threat despite its lethality. 55 of 56 attacking aircraft destroyed, only one penetration. Task Force operations continued without interruption, and while Saratoga required withdrawal for repairs, the other 14 carriers maintained full operations. And the American ability to absorb kamikaze damage and continue fighting showed industrial resilience that Japan couldn't match, because losing one carrier from 15 carrier force reduced American capability by 7%, while equivalent Japanese loss would reduce their capability by 100% because Japan had no operational carriers remaining. Dixon analyzed kamikaze defense statistics and concluded that survival required multiple defensive layers. Fighter interception destroyed 70% of attackers, anti-aircraft fire destroyed 28%, 2% penetrated, and these statistics meant that degrading any defensive layer would increase penetration rate exponentially. That fighter interception was critical first defense because every kamikaze destroyed at 50 miles was one that anti-aircraft guns didn't have to stop at 5 miles, and Dixon recommended increasing combat air patrol further to 10 fighters per carrier, recommended positioning fighters in defensive layers at different altitudes and distances, recommended radar picket destroyers positioned 60 miles from Task Force to provide early warning. If you want to see how Task Force 58's 15 carriers overwhelmed Japanese defenses, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories of American naval dominance. And please subscribe if you haven't already. The kamikaze threat also required changes to carrier construction and damage control. New Essex-class carriers commissioned from 1944 forward had reinforced flight decks that could absorb kamikaze impact better, had improved firefighting equipment that could suppress gasoline fires faster, had damage control procedures specifically designed for kamikaze damage, and these modifications reflected American ability to adapt tactically and technically to new threats, reflected organizational flexibility that allowed continuous improvement based on combat experience. But despite defensive measures and technical improvements, Kamikaze remained an existential threat to carriers because one successful attack could sink ship worth $70 million and kill 3,000 sailors, and Dixon, who coordinated Task Force 58 operations, understood that every hour within range of Japanese airfields was an hour of exposure to suicide attacks that required perfect defensive execution, and the psychological strain on fighter pilots and anti-aircraft gunners who knew that missing one kamikaze could kill thousands created stress that continuous combat made worse, and Task Force 58's sustained operations near Japan required not just tactical excellence, but psychological endurance that tested American sailors as severely as any combat they'd faced. March 18, 1945. And Task Force 58 launched its largest strike yet, 1,240 aircraft attacking airfields and ports throughout Kyushu preparing for Okinawan invasion, and this strike represented peak operational capability where 15 carriers launched simultaneously, creating air armada larger than most air forces, where coordination worked flawlessly, sending 1,200 aircraft to dozens of targets then recovering them without confusion, where American carrier warfare had evolved from desperate defensive actions of 1942 to methodical destruction of enemy capability through overwhelming force systematically applied. Commander Dixon coordinated this massive strike from Lexington flag plot, monitored radio communications as strike groups reported hitting targets, tracked aircraft fuel states and combat damage, sequenced recovery operations so that damaged aircraft landed first, directed fuel-critical aircraft to nearest carrier regardless of which carrier they'd launched from, and Dixon's coordination reflected 3 years of doctrine development and operational experience that transformed carrier warfare from improvised tactics into systematic procedure that allowed Task Force 58 to conduct operations of unprecedented scale and complexity. The March 18 strikes achieved devastating results. Japanese airfields at Kanoya, Kagoshima, and Miyazaki struck repeatedly, destroying estimated 500 aircraft on ground. Shipping and ports attacked, sinking 18 vessels including 2 auxiliary carriers. Industrial facilities bombed, causing extensive damage, and American losses were moderate. 76 aircraft shot down or lost to operational causes from 1,200 sorties, meaning loss rate of 6% was higher than preferred, but acceptable given strength of Japanese defenses and importance of preparing Kyushu area before Okinawan invasion. But what made March 18 significant wasn't just the damage inflicted, but the operational tempo demonstrated. Task Force 58 launched 3 major strikes in one day: morning strike with 420 aircraft, midday strike with 380 aircraft, afternoon strike with 440 aircraft, and this sustained pressure prevented Japanese forces from recovering between attacks, prevented repair of damaged airfields, prevented dispersal of surviving aircraft, and cumulative effect of 3 strikes in 12 hours caused more damage than 3 strikes spread over 3 days because Japanese couldn't adapt between attacks. Recovery operations after afternoon strike illustrated coordination challenges Dixon managed, 1,240 aircraft returning to 15 carriers within 90-minute window, with various aircraft in different conditions, some damaged requiring immediate landing, some fuel-critical requiring nearest carrier, some carrying wounded crew requiring priority, some with hung bombs or torpedoes requiring special handling, and Dixon sequenced recoveries so each carrier took its own aircraft, while also accepting diverts from other carriers, and this flexible recovery prevented losses that rigid procedures would have caused. Lieutenant James Swope, Helldiver pilot from Bunker Hill, returned from Kanoya strike with aircraft damaged by anti-aircraft fire, fuel gauge showing 20 minutes remaining, hydraulic system partially failed making landing gear extension uncertain, and Swope radioed he was fuel critical and requested priority landing, and Dixon, hearing Swope's call, directed him to Essex, which was closest carrier with deck clear, and Swope landed safely aboard Essex despite his aircraft being from Bunker Hill, was refueled and rearmed, and flew back to Bunker Hill next day after repairs, and this flexibility where aircraft could land on any carrier rather than only their home carrier was critical capability that prevented unnecessary losses. But flexibility created complexity. Each carrier maintained different aircraft inventory, each carrier's maintenance crews worked on unfamiliar aircraft, each carrier's aircraft handling procedures varied slightly, and Dixon had to coordinate not just immediate recovery, but subsequent operations where aircraft from multiple carriers were scattered across Task Force 58, and returning each aircraft to correct carrier while maintaining operational readiness required detailed tracking and communication that Dixon's staff managed through systematic record-keeping and radio coordination. The sustained operations also strained pilots and crews. Carrier aviators flew 2 or 3 missions daily, maintenance crews worked 18-hour days keeping aircraft operational, flight deck crews conducted launch and recovery operations continuously with 4-hour breaks, and the operational tempo that Task Force 58 maintained for 60 consecutive days without port visit exceeded anything previous carrier forces had attempted, exceeded human endurance levels that Navy medical officers considered sustainable, and the cumulative exhaustion contributed to operational accidents and reduced efficiency that Dixon had to account for when planning operations. But Dixon understood that exhaustion was acceptable price for operational success. Japanese forces were more exhausted defending against continuous attacks than American forces were conducting attacks. Japanese couldn't rest or recover while Task Force 58 maintained presence. Japanese airfields stayed suppressed because they were hit before repairs completed, and American operational tempo was weapon itself that degraded Japanese capability through exhaustion as much as through direct damage. March 25, 1945. 68 days since Task Force 58 departed Ulithi for operations against Japan, and Dixon compiled casualty statistics that showed the human cost of sustained carrier warfare. 1,143 aircraft lost to combat and operational causes, 967 aircrew killed or missing, 842 aircrew wounded. For carriers damaged requiring withdrawal including Saratoga, Franklin, and Wasp, 4,212 sailors killed from kamikaze attacks, and these losses, while militarily acceptable, were humanly devastating, represented families destroyed, futures ended, potential unfulfilled, and Dixon, who tracked these statistics professionally, felt them personally. The specific human cost was visible in every squadron. VF-9 from Yorktown had started operations with 48 pilots, had lost 19 killed or missing, had received 12 replacements, currently had 41 pilots of whom only 15 were originals, and the personnel turnover meant experienced pilots were minority in squadrons that had been veteran units 2 months ago, meant squadron cohesion and tactical effectiveness degraded despite replacements because new pilots required time to integrate, and continuous combat prevented the training periods that would allow new pilots to achieve proficiency. Lieutenant Commander John Bridgers, VF-9 Squadron Commander, felt responsible for every pilot lost, felt each death personally because he'd ordered them into combat, had assigned them to missions that killed them, had written letters to families explaining deaths he couldn't prevent, and Bridgers, who'd been flying combat since 1942, understood intellectually that casualties were inevitable, but couldn't accept emotionally that men under his command died while he survived, and the psychological burden of command in sustained combat created stress that Bridgers managed through professional discipline and dark humor, but couldn't eliminate. The flight deck crews suffered differently. They didn't face enemy fire like pilots, but they worked 18-hour days in dangerous conditions where mistakes killed people, where aircraft crashed on landing crushing crew members, where propellers struck crew who got too close, where catapult launches threw crew overboard, and the cumulative exhaustion made accidents more frequent, made safety procedures harder to follow, made every launch and recovery cycle opportunity for catastrophe, and the flight deck crew casualties from accidents rivaled combat losses from enemy action. Aviation machinists made second-class Robert Henley, flight deck crew on Essex, had been working launch and recovery operations for 60 consecutive days, averaged 4 hours sleep per night, had witnessed 3 fatal flight deck accidents including friend killed by propeller strike, and Henley who'd been enthusiastic volunteer in 1943. Was now exhausted survivor counting days until Task Force 58 withdrew for rest, and Henley's exhaustion was typical rather than exceptional, was shared by thousands of sailors maintaining carrier operations despite human limitations. But despite casualties and exhaustion, Task Force 58 maintained operational tempo because American depth allowed rotation, damaged carriers withdrew and were replaced by fresh carriers from Ulithi, exhausted squadrons rotated with rested squadrons, worn-out aircraft were replaced with new aircraft, and the American ability to sustain operations through continuous replacement was advantage Japanese forces couldn't match because Japan lacked replacement carriers and aircraft and pilots lacked industrial capacity to replace losses, lacked organizational depth that allowed sustained operations. Dixon understood that casualties were ultimately acceptable because they achieved strategic objectives. Task Force 58's operations had destroyed Japanese air forces in Kyushu, had prepared conditions for Okinawan invasion, had demonstrated American ability to operate near Japan with impunity, had broken Japanese morale by proving defenses couldn't stop American attacks, and the strategic results justified tactical losses because alternative, not destroying Japanese air forces before Okinawa would have caused greater American casualties during invasion. April 1, 1945. L-Day for Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, and Task Force 58 transition from striking Japan to supporting amphibious operations, and this transition demonstrated carrier warfare's versatility. The same carriers that had struck Tokyo and Kyushu now provided close air support for Marines landing on Okinawa beaches, conducted combat air patrol protecting invasion fleet from kamikaze attack, struck Japanese reinforcements approaching from Kyushu, and maintained sustained operations. For 90 days, making Okinawa campaign the longest carrier operation in naval history. Dixon coordinated Task Force 58 support operations from Lexington Flag Plot, balanced competing demands where Marines needed close air support and invasion fleet needed combat air patrol and Japanese airfields needed suppression, and all missions required aircraft from same carriers, and Dixon's coordination required prioritizing missions based on threat assessment, allocating aircraft efficiently, and maintaining flexibility to respond to changing tactical situation, and the complexity of simultaneous missions exceeded even Tokyo strikes because Okinawa operations required sustained presence rather than single strike. The kamikaze threat intensified during Okinawa. Japanese launched Operation Kikusui, massed kamikaze attacks involving hundreds of aircraft attempting to overwhelm American defenses through saturation, and Task Force 58 faced suicide attacks daily where success rate was low. But one successful attack could sink carrier, and the psychological strain on American sailors fighting enemy who wanted to die was immense, created exhaustion and trauma that victory couldn't eliminate. On April 7, Task Force 58 aircraft attacked Japanese battleship Yamato attempting suicide run to Okinawa, sank the largest battleship ever built with torpedo and bomb attacks that demonstrated carrier aircraft supremacy over surface ships, and Yamato's sinking symbolized how completely carrier warfare had replaced battleship warfare, how American carrier numerical superiority enabled strikes that Japanese defenders couldn't counter, how Task Force 58's 15 carriers represented more combat power than all Japanese surface forces combined. By June 1945, when Okinawa was secured, Task Force 58 had conducted 90 days of continuous combat operations, had launched 62,000 sorties, had lost 763 aircraft to combat and operational causes, had sunk Yamato and dozens of smaller vessels, had destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft, and had suffered kamikaze damage to multiple carriers including Bunker Hill and Enterprise, and the sustained operations demonstrated American capability that Japan couldn't match. Ability to maintain carrier presence indefinitely through logistics and replacements, ability to absorb losses and continue operations, ability to conduct simultaneous missions of unprecedented complexity. Dixon compiled final assessment showing Task Force 58 had achieved strategic objectives. Japanese air forces in southern Japan destroyed or suppressed. Okinawa ceased providing base for invasion of Japan. American carrier supremacy established so completely that Japanese forces couldn't contest control of seas around Japan. And these achievements validated doctrine that carrier warfare's future belonged to forces that could coordinate multiple carriers, maintain sustained operations, replace losses faster than combat consumed them. June 1945. And Commander Robert Dixon stood in Lexington flag plot reviewing Task Force 58's operational statistics from 6 months of combat: 15 carriers, 1,200 aircraft, 125,000 sorties, 900 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air combat, 2,000 aircraft destroyed on ground, 127 ships sunk, continuous operations for 90 days during Okinawa campaign, and these numbers represented not just tactical success, but strategic transformation where American carrier power had become so overwhelming that Japanese forces couldn't contest control of Pacific waters, couldn't defend home islands, couldn't prevent American operations anywhere within carrier striking range. Dixon thought about the coordination challenges that initially seemed insurmountable: launching 1,200 aircraft simultaneously, recovering them without confusion, defending against kamikaze attacks, conducting replenishment operations, maintaining communications, preventing fratricide, managing crew exhaustion. And Dixon, who'd solved these challenges through doctrine development and systematic procedures, understood that Task Force 58's success resulted from organizational excellence as much as tactical skill, resulted from American ability to solve complex coordination problems through procedure and training and communication. Admiral Nimitz visited Task Force 58 in July and told Dixon, "Commander, what you and Admiral Mitchell accomplished coordinating 15 carriers represents greatest achievement in naval aviation history. No force has ever concentrated this much carrier power, operated for this duration, achieved such complete dominance, and your coordination made it possible. Your procedures transformed 15 independent carriers into integrated weapon that Japan couldn't counter." The broader legacy was that Task Force 58 demonstrated carrier warfare's future. Naval power would be projected by carrier task forces, not battleship fleets. Carrier coordination and logistics would determine victory. Numerical superiority multiplied by organizational excellence would defeat tactical brilliance. And the side that could build carriers faster than combat consumed them would dominate naval warfare. And these lessons validated American naval strategy that emphasized carrier construction and doctrine development over battleship construction. Post-war analysis calculated that Task Force 58's 15 carriers generated more combat power than entire Japanese Navy at war's peak. That American ability to coordinate multiple carriers created force multiplication where 15 carriers were more than 15 times as effective as single carrier because mutual support and concentration of force created synergies that isolated carriers couldn't achieve, and this mathematical reality explained American naval dominance more clearly than any tactical analysis. Today at Naval War College, Dixon's coordination procedures are taught as foundation of carrier warfare doctrine, showing how complex operations require systematic coordination, how doctrine prevents chaos, how American organizational excellence enabled tactical success that Japanese tactical skill couldn't overcome. The Memorial, Task Force 58, February-July 1945. 15 carriers. 1,200 aircraft. Strategic dominance achieved through coordination and sustained operations. When American industrial power met tactical excellence, Japanese resistance became mathematically impossible. That's Task Force 58's legacy. Not just 15 carriers, but organizational system that transformed numerical superiority into operational dominance. Not just tactical victories, but strategic transformation that made American naval power irresistible. Commander Robert Dixon coordinated the most powerful naval force in history and demonstrated that coordination matters as much as courage, that logistics determines what tactics can achieve, that American carrier supremacy resulted from industrial capacity plus organizational excellence. That's how 15 carriers attacked Japan simultaneously. That's how Task Force 58 ruled the Pacific through overwhelming force methodically applied.